Silence is not emptiness. It is the place where the self finally becomes audible. Most people fear silence because it removes distraction. But what remains in silence is what has always been waiting to be heard. For Iqbal, silence is not withdrawal. It is the ground where awareness sharpens, and the self gathers strength without noise. Only in silence does the inner voice rise above fear, habit, and imitation. Today, we continue our journey through Khudi, Allama Iqbal's vision of the self. This is episode 42. Slow your breath. Let the noise fall away, and step into the discipline of silence. Silence is often mistaken for absence. But silence is presence without noise. It is the space where the self begins to hear itself clearly. The self learns that noise distracts from truth. Noise demands reaction. Silence invites understanding. The self realizes that silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without interruption. In silence, meaning settles. The self understands that silence is not withdrawal. It is return. A return to the center, where clarity resides. The self notices that silence reveals what noise conceals. Desire clarifies. Fear loosens its grip. Intuition awakens. The self learns that silence is discipline. It restrains unnecessary movement. It preserves inner order. Order strengthens awareness. The self understands that silence allows thoughts to pass without domination. Thoughts observed lose authority. Awareness grows stronger. The self realizes that silence sharpens perception. Perception refined detects truth beneath appearance. The self sees that silence is not passive. It is alert stillness. Stillness charged with attention. The self learns that silence strengthens intention. Intention spoken too early weakens. Intention held silently gathers force. The self understands that silence teaches patience. Patience flourishes where noise dissolves. Noise disrupts continuity. Silence restores it. The self recognizes that silence is protection. Protection from distraction. Protection from distortion. Protection from unnecessary reaction. The self realizes that silence reveals the self's true voice. Not the voice of fear. Not the voice of desire. But the voice of alignment. The self understands that silence deepens listening. Listening uncovers wisdom. Wisdom requires space. The self sees that silence trains the will. Will strengthened acts with precision. Precision reduces regret. The self learns that silence removes confusion. Confusion thrives in noise. Silence orders thought. The self realizes that silence is preparation. Preparation for insight. Preparation for action. Preparation for truth. The self understands that silence nurtures presence. Presence grounds perception. Perception guides response. The self recognizes that silence allows emotions to settle. Settled emotions reveal reality. Reality faced frees the self. The self learns that silence connects inner and outer worlds. Connection stabilizes identity. Identity becomes coherent. The self understands that silence cultivates inner authority. Authority formed quietly endures pressure. The self realizes that silence is the birthplace of insight. Insight changes direction. Direction reshapes destiny. The self sees that silence reveals depth. Depth overlooked in noise becomes visible. The self understands that silence is not retreat. It is preparation for meaningful action. The self learns that silence is a discipline. Practice daily. It transforms perception. The self recognizes that silence allows truth to rise without force. Truth revealed does not need defense. The self understands silence is not absence of sound. It is the presence of awareness. The self begins to understand that silence is not emptiness. It is fullness waiting to be recognized. Within silence, the self meets itself. Without distraction, the self learns that silence removes unnecessary noise. From thought, noise exaggerates fear. Silence restores proportion. The self realizes that silence allows truth to surface. Without resistance, resistance fades. When attention becomes gentle, the self understands that silence refines awareness. Awareness sharpened distinguishes what matters from what merely demands attention. The self sees that silence dissolves inner conflict. Conflict thrives on reaction. Silence interrupts reaction. Interruption restores balance. The self learns that silence deepens perception. Perception cleansed recognizes subtle movement within thought and emotion. The self understands that silence is the doorway to self-observation. Observation without judgment reveals patterns clearly. The self realizes that silence teaches restraint. Restraint prevents unnecessary expression. Expression measured carries greater weight. The self sees that silence strengthens emotional maturity. Emotion unexpressed in haste matures into insight. The self learns that silence cultivates patience. Patience enables comprehension. Comprehension deepens wisdom. The self understands. That silence organizes thought. Thought organized. Clarifies intention. Intention clarified. Directs action. The self recognizes. That silence creates space for intuition to emerge. Intuition speaks quietly. Silence amplifies its voice. The self learns. That silence steadies the mind. A steady mind responds rather than reacts. Response preserves harmony. The self understands. That silence strengthens self-trust. Trust built internally reduces dependence on approval. The self sees. That silence nurtures self-respect. Self-respect emerges when noise no longer governs action. The self realizes. That silence allows emotion to complete its cycle. Unfinished emotion lingers. Completed emotion liberates. The self understands. That silence reveals inner contradictions. Contradictions noticed can be resolved. Resolution restores coherence. The self learns. That silence provides space for values to surface. Values clarified. Guide choice. The self recognizes. That silence deepens awareness of time. Time slows. Presence intensifies. Moments expand. The self understands. That silence strengthens attention. Attention stabilized. Directs energy efficiently. The self sees. That silence fosters inner freedom. Freedom from reaction. Freedom from compulsion. Freedom to choose deliberately. The self realizes. That silence awakens humility. Humility allows learning. Learning refines character. The self understands. That silence cultivates discernment. Discernment distinguishes truth from impulse. Impulse mastered prevents regret. The self learns. That silence creates harmony between thought and feeling. Harmony nurtures balance. Balance supports clarity. The self recognizes. That silence invites depth. Depth enriches experience. Experience refined strengthens identity. The self understands. That silence anchors the self. During uncertainty. Uncertainty without silence breeds anxiety. Silence restores steadiness. The self realizes. That silence prepares the self for meaningful speech. Speech rooted in silence carries wisdom. The self sees. That silence is not withdrawal, but alignment. Alignment precedes effective action. The self understands. That silence is a form of strength that requires no display. Its power lies in presence alone. There comes a moment when the self understands. That silence is not absence of life, but the ground from which life rises. Noise consumes energy. Silence restores it. The self realizes. That silence allows truth to approach without resistance. Truth does not force itself. It appears. When the mind is still enough to receive it, the self understands. That silence teaches listening, not only to others, but to the movements within. Listening refines awareness. Awareness refines being. The self learns. That silence reveals attachment. What disturbs silence reveals what binds the self. Awareness loosens these bonds. The self sees. That silence dissolves unnecessary struggle. Struggle fueled by noise fades. Effort guided by calm remains. The self understands. That silence deepens perception of time. Time no longer rushes. It flows. Flow restores harmony. The self recognizes. That silence teaches humility. Humility born from silence does not need validation. It stands quietly confident. The self realizes. That silence nurtures courage. Courage rooted in stillness is unshakable. Noise-driven courage collapses quickly. The self sees. That silence clarifies intention. Intention purified acts with precision. Precision conserves energy. The self understands. That silence holds memory differently. Memory without noise becomes wisdom. Wisdom guides gently. The self learns. That silence stabilizes emotion. Stability prevents distortion. Distortion clouds judgment. Clarity restores truth. The self realizes. That silence brings the self closer to its original nature. A nature not shaped by noise, but by awareness. The self sees. That silence renews perception. Renewed perception discerns subtle meaning. Subtle meaning enriches existence. The self understands. That silence strengthens discernment. Discernment prevents unnecessary conflict. Conflict avoided preserves peace. The self learns. That silence protects inner space. Inner space allows creativity. Creativity awakens potential. The self realizes. That silence transforms solitude into companionship with the self. Loneliness fades. Presence remains. The self sees. That silence is not emptiness. It is fullness waiting to be recognized. Recognition deepens being. The self understands. That silence creates balance between inner and outer worlds. Balance stabilizes life. The self realizes. That silence prepares the self for right action. Action grounded in silence rarely misleads. The self sees. That silence matures judgment. Judgment matured guides behavior with care. The self understands. That silence fosters respect. Respect for self. Respect for others. Respect for existence. The self learns. That silence allows the soul to breathe. Breath returns rhythm. Rhythm sustains vitality. The self recognizes. That silence holds space. For transformation. Transformation unfolds naturally. When resistance ends, the self understands. That silence is not withdrawal from life. It is alignment with it. Alignment creates clarity. Clarity reveals truth. The self realizes. That silence is the ground from which all wisdom rises. And in silence, the self finally hears what has always been calling.